Hello everyone and welcome to the congregation. My name is Ryan MacLeod of the Clan MacLeod, and this is a letter writing talk and show about video games, or anything video game adjacent. Basically, you can write into us via the email address at the bottom of this screen, or if you're watching in the future, please check a latest video for the latest instructions, and we will read out your letter here on air. This will be live streamed eventually, but in these early days, while there is little in the way of subscribers, we're just re-recording these in advance and reading out articles from the internet in the same way we would any letters you writing. Only difference right now is I'm choosing the subjects, but the choice of subjects will be completely up to you if you want to write into this show. Again, it could be anything about video games. If you want to talk about your favourite game of all time, if you have a specific memory linked to playing video games, time shared with family or friends, or if you want to talk about the industry itself, whether it's the problems of executives among publishers, or if you want to talk about achievements in video games, or even want to talk about something adjacent to video games such as movie adaptations, tie-in media, or even board games. A lot of video game properties are making their way into the board game space as of late. Anything you want to talk about on this show, as long as it's video game or video game adjacent, please feel free to write in. As I said, we are using articles in these early days. Now, the first article is talking about Evolve from Turtle Rock Studios, which was released back in about 2014. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is that at the time of the recording, Back 4 Blood, which is their latest game, has just released an open beta, and last week it was in closed beta. And for a lot of people, there's a lot of red flags appearing for this game. Now, to understand the red flags that come up, we do need to take a look back at Evolve. So, this first article was written by Shan Nawaz over at adamogaming.com. Shan writes, when Turtle Rock Studios Evolve was announced in 2014, audiences were clamouring to get their mitts on the monster/shooter hybrid. Marketed as an asymmetrical multiplayer game, one player assumes the control of a monster, while the other 4 players pilot hunters from a choice of 4 classes. The notion of tracking and hunting a player-controlled beast who grows stronger the longer it remains at large presented an interesting dynamic. Matches began with the beast on the back foot, but as it evolves, hence the name, the tables quickly turn and the hunters become the hunted. On paper, this sounded like an exceptionally inventive concept, with a fresh take on the multiplayer team-based genre, using alluring trailers to showcase the best bits. How did Evolve fail so catastrophically? Issues with the game became prevalent the very day it launched. Evolve was marketed and sold as a full-price game at around £50. Nothing unusual there. What made this particularly flagrant, though, was the insane amount of nonsensical DLC that was available from day one via the in-store marketplace. To put it into context, Evolve launched with almost £100 of paid DLC. When that brand spanking new game you've just bought tries to sell you double its worth in DLC, you know you're dealing with pure malice. What's worse is the sheer number of game editions, each offering more content depending on how much you're willing to shell out. With several editions, variants, pre-order bonuses on offer, the excitement among fans quickly dampened as Evolve's predatory nature became increasingly apparent. Admittedly, a lot of this content was purely cosmetic and non-essential, so we can give this a pass for now. The game launched with a pitiful amount of content for players to enjoy, with the 4v1 flashlight mode comprising the majority of the game. A single player mode was included at launch, but defining this as a campaign mode would be incredibly generous. It was essentially the regular mode, with AI controlled teammates. I'm not making this up. Compounding these issues was the pathetic amount of significant DLC. Excluding redundant skins for weapons and monsters, Evolve eventually released semi-worthwhile DLC in the form of new hunters and monsters. The impact of these new characters' cause was nothing short of catastrophic. The game soon took a pay-to-win stance, as even those who lacked any semblance of skill could buy this new DLC and dominate matches with hugely unbalanced characters. The game's notoriety has served as a lesson to developers to refrain from succumbing to greed. Admitting to their mistake, 2K did eventually concede an attempt to salvage the game by reverting to a free-to-pay model. Although this did restore some life to the asynchronous multiplayer game, It simply wasn't enough to jumpstart the franchise once more. So with a heavy heart, 2K finally pulled the plug, executing Evolve as unceremoniously as possible. Press F to pay respects. So regarding Shan's opinion there at the end of the article about serving as a lesson to developers for succumbing to greed, I don't think that's necessarily the case. So, to sum up, basically, there was this feeling amongst us when Evolve launched that a lot of content that was developed for the game was hidden behind DLC and season passes, etc. It felt as a bit egregious, and at the time, 2014, we're talking 6-7 years at this point, we hadn't really seen anything like that. Now, the reason red flags are waving for Back 4 Blood is that it's been, it's been announced that, there's all these various editions available. It's going to be season passes, there's going to be DLC cosmetics, and if you remember Evolve, the two are launching in very similar states. I don't think this is really an issue now. The reason I don't is that I think Evolve was just too early in the hyper focus on microtransactions and season passes. This is par for the course these days. When you look at games like Assassin's Creed, for example, they launch with multiple editions of games, as do most games at this point, especially your Call of Duties, anything that's hyper-focused around multiplayer. And Back 4 Blood being a multiplayer game, I'm honestly not surprised. Now, if this never came with the baggage of it coming from Turtle Rock, who have previously done Evolve, I don't think people would be making as big a deal as this, as we currently are. But again, players have been burnt once before, and players remember. We're getting to a place now in gaming where if a studio messes up, that's a lesson learnt. Let's look at the Cyberpunk and the CD Projekt Red situation. I can guarantee whatever their next game is in a few years from now, there will be a hyper focus on having them under a magnifying glass, watching everything they do. Because we've been burnt once before by Cyberpunk, we're not going to be burnt again. I wish we could say the same thing about other things in the industry, but you get my drift. Let's look at Hello Games. I'm sure eventually they will move on from No Man's Sky. The next game that comes up, we will ask, will this launch in a similar state as No Man's Sky? I think ever since Assassin's Creed Unity, I think whenever Assassin's Creed game comes out, there is that eye of skepticism, even so many years after the fact. Will this launch in a satisfactory state? Gamers remember, and they always will, for better or worse. Now, personally, my red flag around Back 4 Blood is, at the time of recording, as I said earlier, it's in open beta at the moment. I downloaded it, played it, enjoyed it, but I didn't replay it. I didn't feel the need to go back and replay it. Now, whether that's because it's a lack of content in the beta itself is one thing. We will see how the main game pans out. Now, I'm a Game Pass subscriber, so I will be playing it day one regardless. But if I was on PlayStation, or if I wasn't subscribed to Game Pass, etc., I would maybe be holding off until I see how the game pans out at this point. And from what a lot of us seeing on Twitter and Reddit, the sentiment's kind of there amongst most people that, this doesn't peg us as the game that's due to be replayed over and over, and the game's going to be encouraging that for something called supply lines. That's going to be your main sort of form of progression outside of just progressing through the campaigns. For me personally, another thing that Back 4 Blood's kind of got against it is Left 4 Dead, which the game has been compared to since Turtle Rock worked on the original two Left 4 Dead games. Left 4 Dead kind of had a tongue-in-cheek about it. It didn't use any specific guns, you just had machine gun, sniper, shotgun. And it also had that kind of B-movie vibe as well, to the point where you had credits roll at the end of each level. It didn't take itself too seriously. Whereas Back 4 Blood does take itself seriously. You don't just have assault rifle, shotgun. You've got your Call of Duty style types of assault rifle, shotgun, your M4 carbine, your AK-47. It's just smothered in sincerism. The game's design as well, it just kind of looks bland. one YouTuber I was watching actually just before I was recording there, and I can't remember his name, I'm so sorry. If anyone happens to watch this and know who I'm talking about, put it in the comments. But he said that if you removed the HUD from the game, you would not be able to tell what game this was, and that actually sparked a light bulb in my mind. You know what? He's fucking right. But yeah, at this point, I think we'll just wait and see how the game pans out at launch. However, I think we need to let go of the season pass cosmetic angle at this point for this game. I'm not saying as an industry at large we should necessarily succumb to the fact that this is a given. I don't necessarily think it should be a given, but I don't think this should be the main driving point at the moment, because again, at this time anyway, it's all going to be cosmetic. But again, that's what Evolve was like at launch. And with that, let's go on to our next subject. Now, I'm going to do this segment a little bit differently than I usually would. Usually I'd read out an article or letter first, and then I'll move on to give my thoughts and opinions. However, one of the subreddits I'm hooked up to and check on the regular is gaming suggestions, and just like it sounds, it's where people post when they're looking for a specific type of game and the community can help them out. The one game I always find myself referring people to is What Remains of Edith Finch. Now, this game launched a good few years ago now, I think 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It's from the same developers that made the Unmade Swan, if you played that one back in the day. Sorry about that. So I always find myself recommending What Remains of Edith Finch to people. And the reason I do that is just that it seems to tick so many people's boxes. A lot of people ask, is there a game that I can play in just a few hours? Is there a game that's got a really strong narrative? Is there a game that will drive me to tears? And, you know, What Remains of Edith Finch always brings it down into that. Now, for those of you who don't know, who've never played What Remains of Edith Finch, it's basically a walking simulator. I don't like that terminology. I hate walking simulators. It makes it sound like if someone says, "Do you want to play a walking simulator?" I'm like, "No, thank you. I'll go out and walk." So I don't like that tab. What I would call it is a first-person narrative game. What Remains of Edith Finch is a first-person narrative game where you're finding yourself strolling through the house that's belonged to the Finch family for generations, and each member of the Finch family has met a unnatural death. Now, the reason for that is left fairly open to interpretation during the game. What's important about What Remains of Edith Finch is the artistry around it. What Remains of Edith Finch is a game ultimately about death. It's about experiencing death. It's about coping with death. Ryan, we're going to start the segment again, okay? So online I'm part of a gaming subreddit called Gaming Suggestions, and as the name implies, it's basically where people come to find suggestions for games to play next from the community at large. Now, for some reason or other, the game I find myself most constantly recommended is What Remains of Edith Finch. It just seems to tick so many boxes for people. Some people want a game that just could be played in a few hours. Some people want a game with a really strong narrative. Now, What Remains of Edith Finch checks both boxes. Now, usually at this point in our segment, I would read out an article describing the game. But I want to talk about a specific part of that game, and I'll go into spoilers. Now, I'm probably going to share this video, or a segment of this video, with the Gaming Suggestions subreddit. I've recommended it so many times now, and I'm a bit sick and tired of copying and pasting the same little spiel. So, I'm just going to talk about my thoughts and opinions on the game first and foremost. I'll then go into spoilers and ask those who haven't played it to kindly come back later. So if you haven't played What Remains of Edith Finch, it's a first-person narrative game. Some might call it a walking simulator. Personally, I really hate that label. If you come up to me and say, do you want to play a walking simulator? I would say, no, I'm going to go outside and walk myself. But the idea is you're exploring this house which has belonged to the Finch family for generations. As you make your way through the house, you're learning about the various members of the Finch family and how they've all died, not necessarily early, but unnatural deaths. Now, it's not a mystery game. You're not walking around trying to figure out what's killed them, who's killed them. It's not like that. It's all accidents and tragedies. You could say the family are cursed. Now, the exact reason for this is left up to interpretation. There are lots of little clues here or there to form your own narrative, I'd say. Lord knows, there's plenty of YouTube videos with their own takes on the game. But it's really hard to go into anything else without spoilers. So I'd say if you're looking for a game that could reasonably be played in about 2 hours, if you want to be a bit more atmospheric and walk around slowly and explore a bit, it might take a bit longer. But if you're looking for a one and done game, I can't recommend anything better than What Remains of Edith Finch. Now, content warning. What Remains of Edith Finch is ultimately a game about death. You experience death during the game, and it's kind of a self-reflection on how we cope with death as human beings. It's something that we're all going to ultimately meet at some point or another, ourselves and friends and family. And it really is a game hyper-focused on that. So if you're feeling a bit down, it's not the game to play in that kind of situation, but it is a beautiful game. In fact, it's still visually, when I close my eyes right now, it's still one of the most artistically constructed pieces of gaming media, and it is a very strong argument in this notion of this video games as art. In fact, it probably is, in my opinion, the pinnacle, I would say. Now, at this point, we are going to talk spoilers. If you're watching the full episode of The Congregation, I'm going to put a spoiler banner up at this point here. So if you want to skip to the next section, you can just scrub through the YouTube video until you see that banner's gone. And if you're watching the bite-sized version segment, if you've came here from Gaming Suggestions, where I will be sharing this, turn off the video now, and please come back and watch the rest once you've finished the game. I promise you, if you like strong narrative, you won't regret this. Recording. Folks, I had to stop recording there for a few minutes, so if there's a noticeable change in the camera or my hair, then you'll have to forgive me. But anyway, moving on to our spoiler section. This article's called "In What Remains of Edith Finch, Chopping Heads Tells a Powerful Story." It's written by Abju Webster over at The Verge. If I recall correctly, this was written just before it was released. I've lost count of the number of fish heads I've lobbed off. For the past 10 minutes I've been standing on one spot, pulling a dead fish from a conveyor belt, slicing off its head and then grabbing another. But while my hands have been occupied with the monotony of manual labour, my mind has been elsewhere, delving into a fantasy realm as a means to fight off boredom. The longer the workday goes, the more elaborate the fantasy gets. Soon it's hard to tell which is more important, the dream or the reality. The fish chopping story is one of a dozen featured in What Remains of Edith Finch, which launches on PC and PS4 next month. The game follows the titular Edith as she makes her way through a sprawling home in Washington, exploring the history of her family over the course of a century. It's the video game equivalent of a short story collection, with a dozen different tales, each tale uncovering a different family member. But what makes the story unique is how each of us uses a different notion of play to communicate a story, like chopping the heads off fish. Things start out simple. The scene plays out from a first-person perspective, with you, playing as Lewis Finch, firmly planted in front of a fish chopping station. Fish coming from the left, you use the right stick to grab them, pull them to the slicing blade, and then toss them onto the conveyor belt. This process repeats on an endless loop. But at the same time, Lewis starts to fantasize. It starts in the upper left corner of the screen with a tiny black and white maze and a little stick figure hero. You navigate the labyrinth using your left stick, and the further you progress, the larger and more complex the fantasy becomes. It gets colourful and eventually shifts to 3 dimensions. There are characters and cities and oceans and castles. But all the while you still have to keep up with the fish with the right joystick. If they start to pile up too high, they'll intrude on the fantasy until you clear them away. Anyone who has worked a monotonous job knows this feeling, descending into your head while still doing your work. It certainly brought me back to my odd job days while I was in university, stacking boxes in a factory or laying down sod for a new garden. And the game manages to get this across without making control itself a burden. Even chopping head off the fish nor the navigating the fantasy maze are complicated, but they are both a little bit demanding of your attention at the same time. This is then coupled with a narrator describing Lewis's backstory and present situation. You're hearing the story, but you're also living it. Lewis's story started out a very complicated and fish-chopping situation where the boss would get angry at you and you'd have to chop the fish and also clean the barrel out, says Ian Dallas, creative director at developer Giant Sparrow. It was this thing that was way too complicated, but in isolation it seemed like this thing where you need these mechanics to be engaging enough. On paper it sounded like you needed that, but because you have this other story going on, it's not enough to say, oh, it's busy work. It doesn't have to be that hard. The fact is it always given enough of the flavour that we wanted. The stage isn't hard, if anything the task is a little boring. The power of the moment is that cutting heads off fish can become, even as you're doing it, forgettable. You suddenly become lost in the fantastic maze, and in that moment Edith Finch isn't just a video game, but a game about the experience of video games. Then the dead fish pile up, and it's back to the chopping block. Now, as we do on this channel in these early days, we are reading out articles from the internet. Now, this is a very small excerpt of a much larger article. So, I would encourage you to go to the link in the description to read the full article, because it's a very long interview with the creative director there, and we just got the one quote. And it talks a lot about how the entire game was designed, not just the fish segment. But I wanted to talk about the fish segment today, because to me that's the one scene that seals the argument I made earlier about, games as an art form. Art is art when it helps you reflect on your own life in some way. And I think a lot of us, as the article was saying, I think a lot of us can relate to this idea of kind of going into your own head when you're doing a monotonous job. I myself, in my day job, I do find myself going into my head quite a lot. Not really because of monotony, my job's quite complex, but I've been doing it for so many years now that my body kind of goes off into an autopilot. I don't say I necessarily drift off into fantasy to the extent of Lewis Finch, but I think a lot of people who are creative in nature can associate with this idea of, while working away at something, anything monotonous, how your head can kind of drift off. Either, let's just say you're a musician and you're working at a supermarket or something like that, or a grocery store, scanning things through the checkout, and all the while you're in your head thinking about a new melody for a new song you're writing. Or if you're a writer doing that job, thinking about what your character motivation's going to be, all the while going beep, beep as you're scanning things through the checkout. So, as a creative person, I really can sort of associate. Now, in the case of Lewis Finch, obviously there was some mental health issues going on there, and obviously the path he went down during the story was a very, dangerous path that anyone should really try to get help for. Although, obviously, in this case, Lewis did try to. And it is a tragic story, but it's a relatable one. Not necessarily to the extent where I could ever see an ending like that for me or any of mine. But additionally, the gameplay mechanic was perfectly reflective of that. As the article was saying, you use your right hand / right analog stick to move the fish while the main action's happening with your left hand and the left analog stick, and that kind of goes back to that autopilot kind of notion I was trying to describe earlier in my job. When you're playing the actual segment of Edith Finch or the fish chopping, you start focusing on the right hand, but a few minutes into it, you've completely forgotten about it, and your hand's doing it automatically. And all your focus is on that left-hand side. But it's a beautiful section. Anyway, just a little bit I like to talk about. Obviously, the main part of this segment was to try and entice more people to play into it. But I really like talking about that fish segment because it's the one part of the game that I will never forget. There's one other one, the tragic one involving the toddler, but that's a sad one for me. So, for this next segment, for all the Dark Soul players out there, what if I told you there was a game out there that predates Dark Souls, predates Demon Souls, in terms of the third person, difficult kind of genre, the Souls-like as we now call them. Now, a lot of Dark Souls and Demon Souls and Soul-likes all borrow the creative DNA from the older RPGs, the first-person dungeon crawlers, which FromSoft made quite a few back in the days of the PS1, for example. But there is one game I would like to recommend for the Sega Saturn, and it's a game that is frequently overlooked and ridiculed. And that is Virtual Hydlide. Hope you can see that there. Just realised I've not got my software up. Now, this article comes from Bad Game Hall of Fame, written by Cassidy, titled Virtual Hydlide. Now, as I've always been saying, we use articles at this early stage of this channel. This article is massive. Absolutely massive. It goes through the entire development history of not just Virtual Hydlide, but the earlier games on which this was based on. So, please check the link in the description for the full article. But here's an excerpt about the actual Hydlide game. History has a funny way of reflecting on innovators. If you look back on popular canon, it's never the folk who tried and failed who get their due. It's the dudes who step in afterward who can capitalise on the groundwork laid. You don't hear much about it until Antonio Meucci's Talk and Telegraph, but Alexander Graham Bell's telephone has gone on to be credited as a game changer for communication. Galileo effectively stole his idea for a telescope from Johann Lipinski Krichner, whose misfortune was not being able to secure a patent for his original optical instrument. But for the grace of God, goes Hydlide, which couldn't precisely nail its attempt at a still theatrical action RPG on the first go, but has suffered obscurity in the shadow of Legend of Zelda in 35 years since. In case you didn't pick up on it, Virtual Hydlide is a retelling of the events of the original game. In fact, according to a statement made in the English manual, Virtual Hydlide should be served as no less than a, quote, perfect 3D reproduction of the original. Take a minute to measure the weight of that statement, and not to build whatever terrifying expectation you may think in your head. Now let go of that expectation completely, and take relief in hearing that T&E, the developer, odd boast, could not be any further from the mark. While Virtual Hydlide might mirror the basic narrative and some of the progression beats of the predecessor, it otherwise chooses to distance itself from such a rigid structure. As a matter of fact, the first you'll do after launching the game is to shake the very foundation of Fairyland, which is the fictional world it's set in, to generate a new world by either choosing to input a seed code which the game will use as a reference when filling up the map, or allow the game to decide at random. This idea would be proposed by Tokiro Daito, who originally took inspiration from roguelike titles he had been enjoying, such as 1993's Toniko no Daboken Fushiga no Dungeon. While Virtual Hydlide itself is not a roguelike, this will not be the last of the inspirations it draws from them. To re-elaborate on the randomised elements, the world seed I mentioned, the game first rearranges the locations of all the pre-established points of interest on the overworld, as well as shaping the surrounding terrain. The dungeons you'll be visiting are also susceptible to randomised layouts, where the floor plans, branching plans, set dressing, and all of the treasures contained within are all subject to drastic differences between generated worlds. What will remain within the same across the playthroughs are the number of floors comprised in each tile set, the bosses in their arenas, and the guarantee that you will find items essential to progressing through the game somewhere within their designated dungeons. In effect, Virtual Hydlide is still very much a linear adventure, requiring completion of the same objectives in the same order every time. So really what this means is the consequential differences between the playthroughs effectively boil down to having to learn new map layouts, and whether or not you'll get lucky in regards to non-key inventory items that might appear, and when. If this bare minimum was all Virtual Hydlide had to handle, it might do the job well enough. Unfortunately, Virtual Hydlide is an action RPG, which means there's only about 100 more objects to account for on screen at any time. Rather than further taxing the 3D rendering and potentially slowing the game to a possibly unplayable extent, the majority of scenery and objects and characters are all rendered as 2D sprites, and made to scale with your distance and to and from them. With this implementation, often what falls to account is the direction you are facing, to where most sprites are simply forward at all times. Foliage, decoration, landmarks, and other miscellaneous props all turning in place as you do. The effect may be genuinely distorting to some, especially given the sheer number of objects liable to appear on screen at any given frame. At the very least, enemy sprites generally tend to be rendered from multiple different angles, so that you're able to rotate around them and effectively flank them as needed. Granted, this would all be pretty standard fare for players already familiar with the likes of Doom and what have you. The difference is, ID Software were clearly a little bit more conscientious of how their sprite display worked, and rarely dared to populate the viewpoint with hundreds of simultaneous sprites at once. It feels as if T&E simply tried to incorporate as many different decorations as they could within each given tile set, likely in the interest of detailed, realistic environments, but ignores considerations for the density of objects on screen. In effect, the game often struggles to scale and redraw them all on a frame-by-frame basis, or to update the screen at a rate reductive to fluid gameplay. To put it bluntly, the frame rate sucks. Managing somewhere in the neighbourhood of 20 frames per second at the best of times, as low as 5 frames per second at its worst. As the game chugs along, it elects to skip or drop frames rather than slow gameplay down, which at least means the tempo is more or less consistent throughout. But poor performance absolutely distracts from your abilities to move and react to enemies and hazards, or to effectively rotate to face a specified intended direction. What's a shame is that the 3D aspects of the gameplay are generally decently impressive for their time, as is the level of detail that went into the 2D sprites. But it's all obscured by so much in the way of jagged scaling and cluttered spaces, and made to perform at a frame rate so pained that many players will simply be unable to tolerate. There's one last point to make about the graphics. Our beloved hero, Jim, yes, his name is just Jim, is completely stiff. And I'm not just talking about the lack of discernible personality. What I mean is to say, by the very nature of being a digitized actor, he only has so many sprites that can be used to convey his presence, and most of them make him out to be like a particularly inflexible robot. Everything from his stand and stance to the way he runs just comes across as rigid and unnatural, and serves to disconnect you from any sense of really inhabiting him. But where his sprite-based approach really begins to lack is in the equipping different armours and ornaments. Where Jim's actor was not photographed actually wearing these plate mails or wielding individual weapons and shields. Where it comes to what's in his hands, you'll find the same stances and animations used across his entire mix and match arsenal. If you choose not to carry fish shields, for example, Jim's emptied offhand will look as if it's flailing in the air as he whops foes with his right hand. And when it comes to different armour, these layers are simply drawn on top of Jim's base model where they seem to fit rather naturally. For Autokiro may have fit to change and update as to be contemporary, and as for a novel idea as random generation may sound on paper, what a Virtual Hydlide fails to offer is a sense of freedom for players, to tackle the set of necessary objectives in whichever order they personally determine to. And while that's certainly not strictly a necessary component for an RPG, I'd argue that it would be suited for Virtual Hydlide more so than the ultimate decision to railroad players along its singular, inflexible path. With its randomly generated map, move away from level-gated combat encounters and consistent tossing of various different weapons and armours, the game really does feel as if it was originally built with the intention for adventurers to visit dungeons in whichever orders they pleased. But with the tool items serving as keys to each of these successive stages, that possibility is completely and thoroughly prevented, and it's a damn shame too, because having that degree of freedom would have made a far more interesting and exciting game. More than anything else, this marks Virtual Hydlide's most wasted bit of potential in my mind. And a damned shame again, I say, because for what it's worth, I actually still enjoy Virtual Hydlide. It's completely uneven, granted, but entertaining nevertheless for me. If you can still look past the dire frame rate situation, as many players of the area were uniquely programmed to do, there's an interesting world to be explored within, with uniquely stylized dungeons, a vast array of enemies to populate them, and randomised aspects to be noted and appreciated across replays. I appreciate the difficulty is never too unfair, with most of its skippable combat encounters, abundance of healing options, and handy continue functionality allowing you to pick up at the beginnings of the dungeon where you should die. If you could approach the game as a sort of guided tour for a twisting and transforming fantasy land, I really do think there's a bit to learn from it and to admire throughout it. Sure, it can sometimes feel a bit empty or sparse, not helped by its rather weak sound library of ambient audio samples, but it still feels like a world worth digitally inhabiting for the course of a typically 2 to 3 hour playthrough. And after that, to check out if it was a new randomised seed, and to see what new feng shui old Nosferatu is trying out his digs. On the other hand, just as I surely understand how folk can play Virtual Hydlide and get nothing out of it, for those raised on more modern action RPGs, Virtual Hydlide must read as pure regression and feel clunkier than straight-jacket charades. The fact that the game presents its own combat is completely skippable, doing little to even attempt to make it compelling, is probably enough to lose most players straight away, and to that must feel like completely Mandarin exploration and navigation, when compared to the likes of Dark Souls or Diablo or what have you, and there hardly seems to be any hooks left with the chance to stick them in. And that's pretty fair, honestly. At the same time, Virtual Hydlide also seems to get a bit further away from what even fans of Virtual Hydlide may have wanted out of it, losing out on simpler combat, the hand-constructed world, and even the comforts of the classic grind. Topping it off with so many new layers of equipment and consumables, and the random chance could feel something like a betrayal to those who appreciate the more uncomplicated qualities of the classic game. So if this game isn't for either the modern or classic action RPG audience, who exactly is it for anyway? And I guess the answer comes down to, well, folks like me, I reckon. Players who can appreciate a game for its ambition while excusing actual execution, who can overlook some of the more barely functional and outright busted elements of the game, while applauding the developers who are trying to aim for. For me, that means going along for the ride on the hero's journey, travelling the unmapped terrain, seeking out the necessary treasures, braving the hostile dungeons, and challenging the head villains in charge. With the rewards and level ups granted for overcoming each trial, I could totally buy into a sense of growth and regression. The sense that Jim had begun as a hapless wimp with just a wooden club to his name, and had become the fairy's chosen knight by the end. Call me sappy or call me simple, but I'm a sucker for the feeling of adventure in games, and Virtual Hydlide managed that feat well enough for me. So, as I said, the actual article is massive. That was a small segment as long as I went on there. But basically, good old Hydlide here, as he was describing, is an RPG when you're going through a randomly generated world and you're going from dungeon to dungeon, collecting items which you require to unlock the next dungeon until you get to the end and fight the big old winged guy here. I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry. For anyone who has a Sega Saturn, because from what I understand, emulation is pretty hard for the Saturn. So if you're fortunate to have a Sega Saturn and you like Dark Souls or Soulsborns, all that jazz, find Virtual Hydlide. I guarantee you won't be disappointed. Well, you may be disappointed in the technical shortcomings as outlined in the article there. Seriously, the frame rate of this is like a flick book. It's It's truly atrocious at times. And the combat, bosses aside, the combat is fairly... you can just run through it. It's fairly optional. There is a point system, an old school point system. Every time you kill an enemy, you get points towards a high score. But there's an in-game store in the game that you can use your points to buy items. So it's not necessarily skippable if you're struggling a bit with the boss battles, if you want to go back and get certain items. The reason I recommend this for people who like Dark Souls and Soulsborne is that it's difficult. It really does scratch that itch that that's ferrying us Soulsborne fans along there. We like that difficulty. Now, half of that difficulty comes from the technical shortcomings, which is a challenge unto itself. But I wouldn't say that's anything to scoff at. I'd say that's a challenge to be taken on. The combat itself, well, it's not necessarily challenging outright. When you've got multiple enemies, that's where it really becomes challenging. And then the boss battles themselves, those are fairly challenging. There is ways to exploit them. If you're going in blind, you won't know what they are. But if you go on YouTube, every Hydlide video out there will show you how to exploit or skip segments of the game. I should also mention there is a speedrunning community for the game as well, which is kind of unusual given the randomly generating nature of the game. So if you want something that's challenging, you've got a Sega Saturn, or if you're thinking about getting a Sega Saturn and starting a wee Saturn collection, Virtual Hydlide's probably the way to go. Not just that, but how cool is that artwork? Now this is the EU artwork. The American artwork's more painted, but this is pure 90s FMV goodage. So personally, I'd rather pick that up for collector's purposes. But if you're in North America, then you get what you get, I guess. So now for our last section of today. I just picked up, finally, Pokemon Sword. It's been out for about 1.5 years now, I think, at this point. The reason why I never pulled the trigger is just because it came out in November 2019, I think. And there was just so many other things coming out around that time, saving up for Christmas. I just couldn't really justify the £50. I was excited to play it. I've not played a Pokemon game since the Game Boy Advance days, maybe the DS days. Anyway, it was at least a decade I'd been out of the game. So I was really excited. I really liked the British aesthetic they were bringing to the game, for the windmills and all that stuff. I always wanted to play a 3D Pokemon game. I'd rather a Zelda-style 3D Pokemon game, which we're now getting in the future, apparently. I can't remember what it was called again, I'm sorry. But yeah, long story short, I just couldn't afford to buy it at the time. And it's an issue I find with most Nintendo products. Now this article comes from Sean Buckley over at CNET. The article's called "Nintendo Switch Games Are Too Expensive, but It Makes Total Sense." When The Legends of Zelda Skyward Sword launched for the Nintendo Wii back in 2011, the motion-controlled adventure was priced at $49.99. This week, Nintendo announced a remastered version of the game for Switch, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD, priced at $59.99 US, adding $1 to the price tag for every year that's passed since the original game's release. Nintendo fans everywhere let out a quiet sigh of resignation. Skyward Sword, a 10-year-old Wii game, is more expensive than it was when it first came out a decade ago, and it's going to stay expensive, because first-party Nintendo Switch games almost never get price drops. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, a port of the Nintendo Wii U game that launched in 2017, still sells for full price almost 4 years later. Super Mario Odyssey does as well, as does the Breath of the Wild, Super Mario Party, and New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe. Everyone dislikes this. In fact, it feels wrong. Nintendo's competitors like Sony routinely and permanently drop prices for big budget AAA games. God of War for PS4 launched in April 2018 for $59.99, but by October the price was permanently lowered to just $39.99. Today it costs just under $20. Marvel's Spider-Man was released the same year and was given a similar $20 price drop in February 2019. Xbox, PlayStation and PC games often see big price drops within the first year, or not long after. It feels like an industry standard practice. As buyers we've come to expect it. And that expectation makes Nintendo's consistently high prices feel jarring, like Nintendo's being unfair. But Nintendo isn't being unfair, it's just following our lead. Because as much as we'd like to pay less for Nintendo Switch versions of re-released Wii U games, we don't. We pay full price, and continue to pay full price, no matter how old the games are. As usual, math and economics ruin everything. According to Nintendo's latest fiscal earnings report, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has sold 33 million copies since launch, earning Nintendo a potentially staggering windfall. And the game is still a top seller. It's still the 5th best selling game on Nintendo Switch eShop to this day, and Amazon's 9th best selling Nintendo Switch game. To put that in perspective, one of the PS4's best selling games, God of War, had sold an estimated 12 million copies by 2019, and Amazon's 23rd best selling PS4 game. PlayStation had to cut its price to keep its buyers interested in Kratos. Meanwhile, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has been selling in record numbers at full price ever since launch. Nintendo games are expensive. Everybody hates it, and yet Nintendo has no reason to drop the prices. It's selling more copies of its games than its competitors and making more money on each copy sold. And for better or worse, Nintendo fans have gotten used to expensive games. Nintendo has cultivated an expectation of expensive games, and even though we don't like it, we've come to accept it. Customers have spoken with their wallets, and Nintendo has heard us loud and clear. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword is worth $59.99, despite being a port of decade-old Wii game that originally sold for $10 less. It still feels wrong, like Nintendo's being unfair, but the data does not lie. We're going to buy it anyway, and once again, Nintendo will print money. A work colleague of mine, good friend of mine, once referred to Nintendo games as evergreen titles, in the sense that they just never drop price. And, both him and the article writer are both correct. If you go back and try to buy an old DS game off eBay, or if you go back and try and buy an old Game Boy Advance games, they're still up in the 20s and 30s, sometimes even $40, sometimes more for a rarer game. And yeah, I honestly didn't really appreciate that until I heard that term, evergreen. I'd heard evergreen before, obviously. I just meant in relation to Nintendo Switch and Nintendo games in general. They're always going to be in high demand. So knowing that it's never going to drop in price, then eventually you're just going to go ahead and pay full price. In fact, why even bother waiting if you know it's not going to drop in price eventually? You're as well just buying it on day one launch day. Now, I actually think this is an industry-wide issue. I don't think that's the right word. I think it's an industry-wide circumstance that's causing Nintendo to do this, to cultivate this kind of market on their console. Now, what I mean by that is, as much as I'm struggling to find the words there, when you look at the types of games that Nintendo offers, Zelda, Pokemon, Animal Crossing, can you name me a game either on Xbox, PlayStation or PC that's like that in terms of tone? No. I think the closest in the last couple of years would be Biomutant, when you're playing that little hamster man. If you want to go further back, Microsoft used to do the Banjo and Kazooie games. What I'm getting at here, and before we go ahead, I'm not going to call Nintendo games terrorists. They're not. Although, obviously, they're highly animated. When you look at Mario, and you look at Luigi's Mansion in particular, they do have that animated thing. Now, Nintendo makes products for people of all ages, but it's enticing to younger people specifically. Xbox and Sony and PC by extension really aren't catered to the child market anymore. They're not. Again, I can't think of a single game. Now, it's not to say that, all games on PlayStation or all games on Xbox aren't suitable for children. We all know everyone's playing Fortnite. Oh, Fortnite, that might actually be a good example. Right, we'll put that next to Biomutant, and that's 2 examples. If you've got any more examples, feel free to put them in the comments below. But Nintendo has a core audience, and that's either children, as they are now, or children who have grew up with Nintendo. People in my generation, I got Pokemon when it first came out over here in the UK, and I bought the Pokemon games consistently right through to I think Crystal might have been the last one. Oh, Platinum. Did that come before or after Crystal? Who knows? I'll look it up on Wikipedia later. Some people will stick out longer. I did eventually move on to Xbox and stuff like that, but I imagine if you're in your kind of late 20s, early 30s, or even older, I probably imagine that you've played Nintendo consistently, and you're always looking for that next Pokemon game, you're always looking for that next Mario game, and the quality is only getting better throughout the years. Like, you couldn't possibly think the Mario will look any graphically better than it did on the Wii, for example. I booted up Super Mario Odyssey last year. Beautiful game, absolutely beautiful. Looks a bit weird when he's standing beside regular humans in the city world. I can't remember what it's called. But when you're going through the old the Princess Peach's castle in the N64 recreation, it's absolutely beautiful. And even right now I'm saying, okay, can't get more beautiful than this. And I bet you 10 years time I'll be biting my words again. So even though it's a very specific art style that Nintendo pursues in all of its games, I mean, really, can you see much difference between Mario, Luigi's Mansion, Breath of the Wild, Pokemon Sword and Shield? Like, yeah, they're different games, obviously, but they've still got that high animated style. It's all about quality. You know what you're expecting, and you know what you're going to get with a Nintendo game. I don't think a Nintendo game's ever had a technical fault at launch. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. The same could technically be said for the other first parties, Xbox and PlayStation, but they will still get day one patches and they'll get updates as they go along, whereas Nintendo just feels like they put a game out, they'll maybe do one patch, and that's it. That's what it feels like to me. Now, me personally, despite now understanding, thanks to the article, why there's a culture of expensive Nintendo games and evergreen games, as my work colleague put it, I still wait for a discount. And obviously that never happens on the eStore, so when I buy Nintendo Switch games, I wait for them to go pre-owned on eBay. And like you were saying earlier, it's not that much of a difference. I think including postage and packaging, I got Pokemon Sword and Shield for about £40, so that's like £10 off retail. I think I managed to bag Luigi's Mansion for £30, so £20 off retail. So I'm still eventually getting the games at the price that I usually look for in my games, but I'm cheap, what can I say? And I think with that, folks, we're going to leave the episode there for today. Again, I'm sorry for the rather awkward cut in the middle of the episode there. I will just wrap up just by reiterating the purpose of this show. Again, this is a letter writing show, so if you want to talk about anything to do with video games, or anything adjacent to video games, please write me a letter at the email address below, and we will read it out on air. And if you happen to be watching this in the future, please check whatever the latest video is to make sure that that's still the email address. And again, it could be anything to do with video games. If you've played Dark Souls, the board game, if you watched the new Mortal Kombat movie that came out, if you want to talk about all this present day stuff with Activision, Blizzard, hopefully after the fact, if you're watching this a few years, that's not an issue anymore. Absolutely anything you want to talk about, even if it's a game that I've not played, like, I'll be happy to look into that game, just for the purposes of feedback. And obviously, if you disagree with anything I've said on this episode, please feel free to write me in, and we'll get a bit of civil discourse going. But other than that, folks, that's everything for just now, so thank you for watching, and we'll see you later on the next congregation. Take care.